Time-lapse photography is an incredible art form. By making your camera take a photo every few seconds, you can effectively turn it into a looking glass into a hidden temporal dimension. It opens up a whole new world of shooting, and the best thing is you might not even need any new equipment to get started. In this tutorial, you will learn how to plan, shoot, and edit a basic time-lapse sequence. We call it a basic time-lapse sequence because the light doesn't change. You won't have to adjust your settings or work with any advanced time-lapse processing software. For time-lapses where the light does change, for example at sunset or sunrise, you need a different technique of shooting as well as editing, and that will be covered in a future tutorial. Speaking of tutorials, this one is available as a free ebook via the download link below. Before we begin, let's talk about what a time-lapse actually is. Say you're shooting video at 25 video frames per second and you play that video back at 25 video frames per second, the speed will appear to be the same from shooting to showing what you just captured. If you're shooting 100 video frames per second and you play back at 25 video frames per second, you will have a slower playback than what you saw in real life. We call this slow motion videography. If, for example, you are recording at 1 frame per second, but you're playing back at 25 frames per second, your apparent speed will be faster. This is what we call time-lapse photography. Now, I mentioned video frames, but we in the time-lapse photography world work with photographs. Why is that? Well, there's quite a few benefits. First of all, your battery life. By shooting photos instead of continuously recording video, you're using way less battery, so you can shoot for much longer. You're also using the full camera sensor, so your resolution will be higher. If you're shooting raw files, which you should be doing anyway, you will have much more latitude to edit your images, from white balance to exposures and recovering highlights and shadows in post. And finally, it is much better for long exposures. You can capture the night sky, the Milky Way, long exposure trails from cars, auroras, etc. The previously mentioned example talked about 1 frame per second. This time between frames or between photos is what we call the interval, and your interval depends on your subject matter. Before we get to that, let's talk about camera equipment. What kind of equipment do you need to shoot your first time-lapse? Contrary to popular belief, you really don't need expensive kit. You need a camera that can be triggered. You need an intervalometer, which can be internal through the menu system or external as a remote. The intervalometer will allow you to choose the interval between photos. The intervalometer will also trigger the camera. You need something to mount your camera with. This can be a clamp or a tripod. Doesn't matter what it is as long as it's sturdy. And you need an interesting subject to capture. This could be a road with cars, a crossing with lots of people, or a cityscape with pretty clouds. Of course, don't forget your lens, your camera battery, your memory card, etc. Once you've gathered all your equipment and you've arrived at your interesting location, you should think forward into the future before you start shooting, because the situation you find yourself in might change and it might ruin your shot, and nothing is worse than being halfway through a time-lapse shot and having to start from scratch. Are you potentially in a very windy spot? Will the tide rise and will waves splash water on your lens? Will there be tourist buses later on when the sun is setting or the light is nice and they will walk around and bump into your tripod? Are you on a boardwalk or on a bridge that will vibrate with increased traffic, leading to shaky time lapses? Try to think forward in time to prevent you from having to start your time-lapse from scratch. Now let's get started. Power on your camera and set it to M or manual mode, and make sure you're shooting both RAW and JPEG photos. Use the light meter or the histogram to dial in the correct exposure, and make sure that your white balance and your ISO are also set to manual. I recommend shooting on the widest possible aperture that your lens has. This is to prevent you from having to fix aperture flickering in post. Aperture flickering is caused by minuscule mechanical differences between each photo when the aperture closes. This leads to a distracting brightness flicker, which we can solve in post later on, but ideally you get your shot right in camera. So everything is set to manual and your exposure is correct for your scene. Now frame up your shot, make sure your camera is level, and make sure to disable autofocus as well as sensor or lens stabilization if your camera has it. On your intervalometer, this can be in the menu of your camera or on the external remote that you are using, you have to set up your interval. Here is a rough guideline. If it's people and cars, go with a 1 second interval. If it's clouds and cityscapes, go with a 3 second interval. Anything around sunset or sunrise, around 6 seconds. And anything night sky related, go for a 20-second interval. Once you've double checked all your settings, you can sit back and relax and let your camera shoot at least 300 photos. Now get ready to pack up and move on to the post-production side of time-lapse photography. There are many advanced pieces of software professionals like myself use, for example, After Effects, LR Timelapse, Lightroom Classic, etc. However, because this is the basics of time-lapse, a sort of introductory video, I want to make this as accessible as possible for everyone. So we're going to talk only about free software. The software in this case is DaVinci Resolve, which works on both Mac and Windows, and you can download via the link below. If you really want to keep things as simple as possible, check out GlueMotion, which is another app that works cross-platform that has a step-by-step process. Download it for free and just render out the JPEG sequence that you shot earlier. Now, the first step in post-production is transferring your photos from your memory card to a solid-state drive. We're working on a solid-state drive because they are much faster than spinning hard drives. We're working with hundreds or thousands of photos, and if it's a fraction of a second per photo, that really adds up. The speed increase is worth the increase in price. That being said, SSDs these days are pretty cheap. Now, I mentioned we're working with quite a lot of photos, and if you're going to keep shooting time lapses, you will end up having tens of thousands of photos spread out over different hard drives. So I just want to take a moment to make sure that you're being efficient with your storage formula. I've been using the same layout of my folders as a template for the last decade because every now and then I get a request from a client or a potential client asking for a specific shot. I can go back onto an old hard drive, and because I've used the same folder structure for the last 10 years, I can immediately find my old footage and reprocess it or remaster it and sell it to them. I highly recommend you work with something like below. This shows the date, the shoot name, and in that the project file folder, the raw folder, which holds all the photographs, and the renders folder, which is where you'll put your exports. Your exports or your renders is of course the video file that we're going to create out of the photo sequences. This might seem like overkill, but trust me, I've been doing this for a very long time. Having a consistent folder structure is absolutely crucial in the time-lapse game. As we're working with raw image sequences and we're going to DaVinci Resolve, we need to have a unified image file. Not all raw files are the same, so we're going to transcode our raw photos into a DNG sequence. DNG sequences are recognized and are editable in DaVinci Resolve. Not all raw files are that. So download the Adobe DNG converter, which is also of course free via the link below. Install it and open it and follow the steps to turn your raw sequence into a DNG sequence. This is extremely straightforward and shouldn't take too long. It pretty much repackages the raw file into a DNG file. Then once you have your DNG sequence, make sure that you've installed and opened the latest version of DaVinci Resolve, also available via the links down below, and import that DNG sequence into the DaVinci Resolve media window. Make sure that your files are sequential. This will make sure that DaVinci Resolve recognizes that as a sequence and will effectively treat that image sequence as a video file. Create a timeline with that video file, add a optional color grade using the curves and the wheels in the color tab of DaVinci Resolve. Then you go to the Deliver tab and export a H.264, H.265 or Apple ProRes file as your master file of your time-lapse. And there you have it. You've created your first professional high-grade basic time-lapse sequence using nothing but equipment that you probably already owned and free to use software. I started shooting time lapses about 13 years ago, which makes me feel really old saying that, but over those 13 years I've worked with an incredible amount of brands, agencies, people, creators, you name it. And having all that knowledge from over a decade of professional shooting, I've distilled all of that in 2 courses. I have the Time-Lapse for Beginners course, and I have the Ultimate Time-Lapse course. You can find both of those down below. But of course, I also have my free ebooks, which teach you everything there is to know about planning, shooting, and editing professional grade time-lapses. If you have any questions, please drop them down below. Thank you so much for tuning in, and make sure to subscribe to this channel if you like all things time-lapse and hyperlapse. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you on the next video.